When you look at Iran attacks Israel, that's what every headline says, right? It's Iran attacks Israel, Iran attacks Israel. Iran launches a barrage of missiles at Israel. Now, there's a few points of irony in that. Number one, suddenly Western media has active voice down. Like, there's no problem. The attacker is named every single time. The sentence starts with Iran, and it's this very sort of aggressive way of talking about Iranian actions. The reason I say ironically is because that has been missing in the way that Israel's actions have been presented, not only vis-a-vis Iran, but especially and most importantly, in how Israel has conducted itself in Gaza.
Welcome to the Mondowise podcast. My name is Khader Jabbar. In the past few weeks, Israel has bombed Lebanon, assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, launched a ground invasion, and displaced over 1 million people. Healthcare workers are warning of an apocalyptic situation, with many now sleeping on the streets of Beirut. More than 1,300 Lebanese people have been killed, including at least one Lebanese American citizen. Meanwhile, Israel continues to commit genocide in Gaza and carry out military invasions in the occupied West Bank. On Tuesday, Iran launched over 100 missiles at Israel, targeting military sites in retaliation for Israel's killing of Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. Today I'm joined by SL Rad. SL specializes in research and writing on Iran policy and U.S Iran relations. Her work has appeared in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. She's been a commentator on BBC World, Al Jazeera, NPR, and others. She holds a PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of California and is the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Welcome, Assal, to the Mondowise podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I think we can start off just from this week's events. As you know, Iran launched over 100 missiles at Israel in retaliation for the killing of Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. Can you give our listeners some context on Iran's motivations for this and how you see this playing out in the short or long term?
Well, one of the things I think that's really important to keep in mind is, and I say this because if we're having this conversation in the West, and so we always have to think about Western narratives and the way that information is presented to us, whether it's through our political leaders and political discourse, our news media, and even in some cases, our popular culture media. Iran is often presented as this sort of, irrational, ideological, zealot country, government, and sometimes the country itself, that is sort of hell-bent on war and attacks, and it's a threat, right? It's always presented as this diabolical threat. And that paints the way that we think about basically everything that comes out of the media. And so when you look at, Iran attacks Israel, that's what every headline says, right? It's Iran attacks Israel, Iran attacks Israel. Iran launches a barrage of missiles at Israel. Now, there's a few points of irony in that. Number one, suddenly Western media has active voice down. Like, there's no problem. The attacker is named every single time. The sentence starts with Iran, and it's this very sort of aggressive way of talking about Iranian actions. The reason I say ironically is because that has been missing in the way that Israel's actions have been presented, not only vis-a-vis Iran, but especially and most importantly, in how Israel has conducted itself in Gaza. And so that distinction is in and of itself important to point out, and understanding like Iran's actions, right? Iran in this particular case was responding to attacks carried out on Iranian soil, right? This was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, in Tehran, at the end of July. As well as obviously there are, Hezbollah is an ally of Iran. And if Hezbollah is under attack, the assassination of Nasrallah, Lebanon being under attack, the attacks that are going on in Gaza, all of this is also part of the Iranian calculus, but very specifically, the reaction is to an attack being carried out on Iranian soil, an assassination being carried out on Iranian soil, which is a violation of its sovereignty. We saw a similar kind of attack carried out in April, and that also was a response, a retaliation to an Israeli attack on an Iranian consulate in Syria, which killed Iranian officials. So it's not just that, Iran is suddenly attacking Israel, it's happening in a context as a reaction to something. Now you might ask, what took Iran so long? Why did they, if they're responding to an assassination that happened in Tehran in July, why, 2 months later is the reaction coming? Because Iran was basically told, do not take any action. And this is by the United States. Do not take any action that might upend the ceasefire talks, right? We spent months of the Biden administration telling us that Israel wants a ceasefire, where we're in ceasefire talks, which really was just a cover to allow Israel to continue its crimes in Gaza. And that's exactly what we've seen. So it was after not only ceasefire talks had failed, but that Israel had expanded its war into Lebanon. That's when Iran finally sort of responded to that assassination. So if you look at it, again, you're seeing this measured response, because what you've seen a pattern of in the case of Iran is avoiding a larger war. We saw this in April. We saw this just in these recent attacks, as well as if you can go back all the way to 2020, right? January of 2020, when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by the United States. Again, you saw a measured response by Iran that avoided any casualties because they do not want a wider war. So that sort of explains the context in which this attack happens.
And I want to talk about a little bit, you touched on it a little, about Iran's kind of measured response recently and in the past. But Iran has stated that it does not want a regional war, but has warned that any Israeli attack, especially on its oil fields, will lead to an unconventional response. We've seen widespread condemnation of Iran's actions from U.S. officials. We've seen in the media, who have remained overwhelmingly silent in comparison to Israel's war crimes. How do you see Iran balancing this type of deterrence and maintaining its kind of image and reputation among, the axis of resistance, without being drawn into a larger conflict by Israel and the United States?
I think the larger problem of the way that the U.S. has acted as a sort of, Biden officials will talk about the U.S. role as a mediator, right? The U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. It's Israel's number one ally. It's providing Israel with the vast majority of its weapons and funding. So the U.S. plays an integral role in what is happening in the region currently. And what you hear a lot from them is nobody should escalate. No one in the region should escalate. But then Israel continues to escalate. And there's not only is there no accountability for Israel, the same response is not given to Israel. So this idea that Israel has the right to self-defense is interesting when you think about the fact that does that mean nobody else has the right to self-defense, right? Self-defense, the right, when you're talking about a series of rights, those rights are bestowed upon everyone. Every nation state has the right to self-defense. Every nation does. And yet every nation is not treated that way. So Iranian consulates can be bombed. Iran should not respond. Assassinations and we're talking about a recent assassination. Israel has a history of carrying out assassinations of Iranian officials, even scientists, right? Scientists are civilians. Israel has assassinated Iranian scientists on Iranian soil, and the expectation is simply that Iran cannot respond to anything. That belies the idea that nations have the right to self-defense. And so that's the biggest problem, is if you think about this notion of deterrence on the Iranian side, if the expectation is simply, and this is for anybody, this is for any state, to sit and take hits and take hits and take hits, but do nothing, well, essentially what is being asked is for them to surrender their sovereignty, to surrender their right to self-defense entirely. And so that's the problem with the way that the U.S. has approached it. And you can see it, for instance, when the assassination of Hania was carried out in July, the U.S. response was Iran shouldn't react. Iran shouldn't do anything that's going to escalate. But as soon as Iran retaliates, now the line from the Biden administration is, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, and this is unacceptable, and so there should be a response. So the response is only one party that is allowed to respond to anything. Then you can use that same logic and apply it to the way that the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel is being framed as well. We constantly hear, well, Hezbollah started this on October 8th. Hezbollah has been carrying out rocket attacks on Israel, and Israel has a right to defend itself. But if you look at the actual facts on the ground, Israel has carried out over 80% of the cross-border attacks between Israel and Lebanon have been carried out by Israel. So if you didn't know that, if you were just hearing the way that the administration is talking about it and the way that the news is covering it, you would think that Hezbollah has carried out 80% of the attacks, or at least an equal amount. But it's overwhelmingly Israel that has carried out more cross-border attacks against on the Lebanese side. So these are the things that are sort of missing, and creates a situation where if you are any other state, you either have to surrender to whatever the US and Israel say, or at some point you have to take some measure of deterrence, or they clearly, as we've seen, will keep hitting. I mean, Israel has not in any way tried to curtail its attacks in Gaza. Despite the rhetoric of ceasefire talks, Israel keeps assassinating the lead negotiators for ceasefires. That is not a state that is participating genuinely in any way in ceasefire talks. But all of that is missing from what we hear from U.S. officials as well as the U.S. media.
Yeah, and as you point out, this past year we've seen Israel commit war crime after war crime in Gaza. They've, have done invasions in the West Bank, everything they've done in Lebanon. I mean, just in the past few weeks, more than 1 million people have been displaced. More than 1,000 people in Lebanon have been killed. This is on top of almost 2 million people in Gaza being internally displaced and more than 41,000 people in Gaza being killed. And yet we fail to see any kind of real accountability being held against them by the United States. And this essentially creates a way where Israel is just kind of making a mockery of international law. And I'm curious to hear from you, because the U.S. has consistently failed to hold Israel accountable or condemn its actions, how much do you think this lack of U.S. action has contributed to the devastation we're witnessing today? And what message does this continue to support or silence send to both Israel and the rest of the world about what is acceptable? And how does it embolden Israel to continue its aggression without fear of any consequences?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. But let's start with the U.S. is not just complicit, it is actively participating, right? Like to say that this is, and we've heard from the State Department, for instance, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller in many briefings when he's asked about Israel's actions will say something like, well, ultimately, Israel is a sovereign state and sovereign states make their own decisions. The U.S. cannot dictate to anybody what they can do. I mean, ask Iraq what they think about that statement. The U.S. can't dictate to anyone. Ask Russia what they think about that statement. Ask Iran what they think about that statement. Countries that have been sanctioned or invaded by the United States. There's countries that have been bombed by the still get bombed by the United States. So the idea that the U.S. just sits back and lets sovereign states do whatever they want to do is absurd on its face. But this is the way that it is approached. So the U.S. is not playing on the sidelines. It is providing the funding, the weapons, the diplomatic community. The U.S. is the one that is helping shred international law. I mean, you can blame Israel because obviously Israel is the one taking the actions, but the U.S. is 100% supporting this, both rhetorically and in action, right? They're saying that they support it, that the support is ironclad, that aid and support is unconditional. What does that mean? What does unconditional support mean? Unconditional support means Israel can carry out a genocide, which is what we're seeing in Gaza, and the U.S. continues to support it, which is precisely what has actually happened. So the idea that there is international law, I mean, it's always been a sort of murky subject. It's always been used since its creation as a sort of tool of imperialism, especially of Western imperialism in the United States. Obviously, the U.S. carried out an illegal invasion itself of Iraq. Had no legal basis to do so, but it did. And so we are not held accountable to anything, but there was always this sort of veneer, right? At least a facade that pretended like international law sort of existed. And I think that's been torn to absolute shreds as you've seen the level of carnage, bloodshed. I mean, the last count that I remember, and I can't imagine how they're still keeping count of anything in Gaza, is 17,000 children have been killed in Gaza alone. I'm not talking about Lebanon. I'm not talking about the West Bank, just in Gaza. And what I think is not part of the discussion at all, because Gaza on its own should be enough. A genocide should be enough to get us to galvanize as an international community to stop something from happening. It shouldn't be something where I say, well, it can affect us too. That shouldn't matter. Killing thousands upon thousands of children should be enough for anyone with basic humanity to want to step in and stop that from happening. But there are other consequences as well. And those consequences are the fact that now really anything is apparently allowed, right? You now have other actors that can do the same thing if they choose, and there's no system of accountability, because if the US attempts to use it, it's an absolute mockery. I mean, we have watched them support the mass slaughter of children. There's no doubt to it. Everybody has seen it every day on their phones for now nearly a year. And that, I think, has completely shattered the international system and the idea of international law. And it's not that they don't know it. That's the most frustrating part. There's no ignorance on the part of the Biden administration. They absolutely know what's going on. They've been questioned about this over and over again. There are resignations from within this administration because of what they are doing, right? So they're being told constantly. There are Americans that are protesting. There are global protests. There are agencies within the US government telling the administration, for instance, USAID, telling the telling the Biden admin, Israel is deliberately blocking aid. They're deliberately starving Palestinians in Gaza. And you have the Secretary of State rejecting and ignoring that. So, and this has happened repeatedly. So there's nothing, there's no excuse left. They are simply lying, right? They're either lying to our faces as if this information is not readily available. They're treating us like we are stupid. And at the same time, what is it based on? I can't say anything besides the absolute dehumanization of Arab and Muslim lives. They have told us over and over again that Arab and Muslim lives do not count for anything. They can be murdered in mass, and it's not a violation of anything, as long as Israel has a right to defend itself.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with you, you have a super fire Twitter profile, and I encourage everyone to follow you on Twitter. But one thing I noticed that you tweet a lot about is your media analysis of how Western media has been framing Israel's actions in Lebanon and in Gaza. And, you know, you're always pointing out Matt Miller, the State Department spokesperson, during his briefings, in his interactions with journalists who are trying to get any kind of real answer from the United States. What's your take on Western media and how they have been perceiving the genocide in Gaza and, you know, Israel's recent invasion in Lebanon?
Well, let me actually make a comment about Miller first, and then we can talk about the media landscape more broadly. So Miller has been asked repeatedly about Israel's war crimes. Israel attacked a hospital. Israel blew up a university. Israel, killed a massacre of civilians. All of these things have been asked repeatedly. And it's funny because many times he'll say, well, we're still assessing. And when he's asked directly, he'll say something like, well, I'm not a lawyer. I can't, I cannot make that assessment, not from this podium. Now, today, he was asked about the fact that in Lebanon, now you see medical facilities being attacked and people killed, right? And how worrying this is as a pattern. And this is the problem when you do not care about international law at all. Once what Gaza has done is normalize the attacks on hospitals, on medical workers, on medical facilities and healthcare systems. Now we're seeing that the beginnings of that in Lebanon. And Miller, and this was in this case, and another question that again was about Israel's attacks on civilians in Lebanon. Essentially, what Miller said is that Israel is allowed to defend itself and is allowed to go after terrorists. And he said, quote, that is just a fact under international humanitarian law. It's so interesting that he's a lawyer now. So when he wants to justify Israel's actions, he can make assessments. But when he has no defense for anything, when he can't answer something, it becomes, I'm not a lawyer. I can't assess that. We're still assessing that. We're still seeing what's going on. Compare that to the way that the State Department has had rolled out assessments of Russian war crimes. It took the U.S. weeks to say that Russia is committing war crimes. Maybe 6 weeks or 2 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Joe Biden called it a genocide. None of that language exists when Israel is talked about. And now we've had a year. And this is an ally. So you very easily should be able to get information on the ground. Now, in terms, this is linked to the media landscape in the sense that these are official narratives, right? These are government officials who are saying, no, Israel isn't deliberately starving them, or no, Israel hasn't committed any war crimes. Like this is what an official government position is, because that government is funding and arming the state that is carrying out these attacks. That means that they have a legal liability, right? The U.S. can't say, yes, Israel is committing war crimes, because if they say that, then the question becomes, well, then why are you sending them weapons? Why are you sending them more money, right? We become complicit in those war crimes in a legal scenario. Also, there's U.S. domestic law, putting international law aside. There's U.S. domestic law that prevents the U.S. from sending weapons or aid to countries that are committing gross human rights violations, using those weapons, or blocking U.S. aid, humanitarian aid. Israel is doing both of these things. So there's all of these implications. So what is the media's role in this? In a free society, right? In a free liberal press, which is what we, sort of pat ourselves on the back in the West and talk about as a cornerstone of democracy.
Matt Miller
that
pats
press
himself
is
on
not
the back
supposed
with that.
Well, he definitely pats, but he's a government official, right? He's being asked questions by journalists. Now, to be fair to reporters, there are many reporters that sit in that room and you can tell, are frustrated by the lack of answers that they're getting, to the point where you hear it from someone like John Kirby, you hear it from someone like Matthew Miller. They'll say, we know our responses are frustrating, but because there are reporters trying to do their jobs. But the media institution is not run by those individual reporters, right? These are larger institutions. Corporate media and the way that it operates in the US is completely different. But it's presented to us as a free media, which means you're not supposed to repeat what governments say. You're supposed to repeat what the truth is. What is the truth? You don't say, I forget where this sort of like turn of phrase or adage comes from, but it's the idea that if someone says the sky is blue and someone says the sky is green, you don't report both of those. You report the fact. You're supposed to be reporting and challenging what the state says. That's the distinction between an authoritarian state that has a state-run media where they're censored and they're not allowed to say certain things, and a free media where you're actually supposed to be getting at the truth. And that is what is so problematic about the overall media landscape. It is not about getting at the truth. It is about creating a narrative. And that narrative is to minimize any culpability or responsibility to Israel. It is to whitewash Israeli crimes. And really, that's just presenting the state narrative as fact. And that's what's so problematic about it. And you can see it in headline after headline after headline. Headlines about, Israel carrying out attacks that don't even mention Israel, right? Airstrikes, but whose airstrikes are they? Explosions, who's causing the explosions? Avoiding certain language, right? Avoiding words like genocide, occupation, ethnic cleansing, Palestine. All of these words are avoided. If it's a terror attack in Lebanon, right? Pagers and devices exploding across the country. You had a former CIA director calling that terrorism, saying that is terrorism. Not one media outlet used the same language to describe those attacks. They called them pager attacks, pager and walkie-talkie attacks, as if the devices themselves are carrying out attacks. Right? No attribution to Israel and no use that would paint Israel in a negative light by using words like terrorism, because that apparently can only be applied to Arabs and Muslims.
I mean, you can imagine if that pager attack was something Iran orchestrated or Hamas orchestrated, what the headlines would be. I've seen these headlines all the time, and sometimes the mental gymnastics that go into writing these headlines, deserve an award of some sort. But was there any that you saw that just made you go, oh my, like, this is ridiculous?
I can't remember sort of the word for word, but there have been several that stand out. For instance, when we reached the 30,000 threshold for Gaza's death toll, the New York Times ran a headline that said, I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was 30,000 lives ended. No, nothing about Israel, nothing about the fact that they were killed,
Right.
And it's remarkable to use that kind of language, like lives ended. That's not even, to your point, sometimes the gymnastics are so odd because it doesn't even sound like normal English. You sort of have to read it again to understand what they're talking about. There was another one when the Flower Massacre happened. I want to say it was back in, there's so many atrocities and massacres to keep track of. It's hard to remember when they happened, but I believe it was in March, when you had Palestinians in Gaza going towards aid trucks when they were starving, and Israeli forces opening fire on them, killing, I think it was something close to 100 or maybe over 100 people. And there was another headline from the New York Times. It sounded like a haiku, right? It was like 3 separate bits of language, all to avoid saying Israel massacred people who were starving Palestinians who were trying to get food. There's a lot of them that sort of stand out for the fact that Israel is missing from it entirely. That, I think, is the most incredible part, that there's no agency or active voice for what is happening in the region as being the actions of Israel. And that's why I said, if you juxtapose that with the way that any action by Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran or any other group or state is carried out, or Russia, right? You get outside of the region for a minute. It's not just about the region. It's the way a U.S. adversary is presented, the actions of a U.S. adversary versus the actions of the U.S. itself or an ally is vastly different.
I think we should have you start a column at Mondowise called the Colonisters Haiku, where you just put all of the ridiculous headlines in one place.
That one was really bad. It was something like, what was it? It was something like shots fired, people. It was something absurd. I can't remember the details of how it was, but I just remember reading it and thinking, why do I have to decode what you're talking about? And the problem is their assumption, like sometimes people are like, well, there's the body of the article and, people know what the reference is. I'm like, no, people don't. People don't know. You're assuming that everybody is paying attention to the news in the same way. But there was polling back in March in the US that showed half of Americans could not correctly answer if more Israelis had been killed or Palestinians. And this is when 30,000 Palestinians had been killed. That's lack of basic information. So if people don't know that, it's because of the way information is being presented to them.
And there's no lack of evidence showing that information being presented is heavily biased.
Yeah.
Now, Assal, you have written a book about Iran. You understand Iran a lot. And just to kind of back up for a little bit, how have U.S.-Iran relations evolved, or how have they been under the Biden administration these last few years?
Well, honestly, there's been a lot more continuity with the Trump administration, because if you think about it, when Biden was coming in as president, obviously because he had served as vice president under the Obama administration, and under the Obama administration, you had this sort of landmark deal and historic moment with the Iran nuclear deal, where there was finally a negotiation that involved directly both the U.S. and Iran, two sort of mutual adversaries who, critics of the deal at the time, said things like, Iran would never negotiate with the U.S. or Iran would never abide by a deal. And now in hindsight, we know that none of that is true. Iran absolutely came to the table and negotiated with the U.S. And even the Trump administration certified the deal until they withdrew from it in 2018, which meant that Iran was abiding by every limitation within it. And I think the thought was when the Biden admin was coming in, and this is based on things that Biden himself said. I mean, he criticized, very ferociously criticized, the presidency of Trump for withdrawing from the nuclear deal. He commended the deal as being, obviously one of the landmark foreign policy achievements of the administration he served as vice president. When the Democratic candidates were asked if they would restore the nuclear agreement, he was one of the candidates who said he would do so. So I think there was very much that kind of an expectation. And on day one, if we remember back that far, but on, day one for U.S. presidents are usually like they try to do a lot of important things on that first day. And he did. He reversed several Trump era policies on that first day. For instance, I think it was like returning to the Paris Accord, reversing the Muslim ban, and other similar kinds of agreements that the U.S. had withdrawn from because of the Trump administration. But he didn't do it with the nuclear deal. And, not to get into, I don't know, too much detail about what happened at the time, but essentially there was this window between January and June when the Biden admin came in and the Rouhani administration in Iran was still in power. To restore that deal. And really, the Biden administration took a very long time to try and negotiate anything. And I think there was a lot of pressure from, likely one of the places where pressure was coming from was Israel, which was one of the only countries in the world that was against that deal. Right? The vast majority of the world, I mean, it is enshrined in a UN resolution, supported the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, but Israel was against it. So it took a long time for them to do anything. And to this day, the US has never returned to the deal. Iran's nuclear program has advanced far beyond what it was before the nuclear deal. All of the sanctions that the Trump administration had placed on Iran, there have been very little changes to that. Some adjustments, especially I think in terms of tech and Iranians' ability to access the internet. But most of those sanctions have stayed in place, and the Biden administration has actually added additional sanctions. So really, we're in no different a place with Iran than we were under the Trump administration. And now you're seeing the potential for Israel to drag the U.S. into a confrontation with Iran. And no apparently not ability, I should say, but choice by this administration to stop Israel from escalating the situation in the region further.
Do you see if Iran does get drawn into a bigger war with Israel and then by proxy with the United States, how do you see Iran's allies like China and Russia reacting?
Well, so ally and partner, and those are different sort of categories, I think, of relationships, where I would see like Russia and China more as partners of Iran. They have bilateral relationships. You're seeing it on the side of Russia. It's certainly growing. The more isolated, not just the more isolated, but I think the more the U.S. tries to use these sort of pressure-only tactics with other nations, whether it's through sanctions, which have been a significant tool that the U.S. has tried to use, or sort of diplomatic force or kinetic force even. You're seeing shifts in the way that the global South tries to approach the U.S. and the West. And I say the West because the U.S. really leads the Western world. It is whether we talk about the fact that there's a multipolar system emerging, at this very moment, the U.S. still wields disproportionate power, right? It is still the most powerful country in the world. And so what you're seeing is an attempt to create some kind of balance. And the results of that are things like Russia and Iran having growing sort of military or defense, I should say, relations, as well as an initiative like BRICS, which is an economic initiative for the global South. So all of these things are to challenge both the U.S. like military dominance as well as economic dominance. That's in part because those states don't see the US as a even-handed broker, right? They're not really using the international system in a way that's fair across the board. Now, does that mean that those particular actors are, good actors? If you want to speak in these sort of absurd good and bad dichotomies that really don't get at the complications of any situation? No. But the point of the international system is to hold everybody accountable under it. And the question isn't why do you want to hold Russia accountable for invading Ukraine? Clearly, Ukraine is a sovereign state and should not be invaded. The question is, how can you use that system when you're using it selectively? And I think that's more and more the challenge that you see from the global South, is to challenge the West on its hypocrisy. And the situation in Gaza and what Israel has done in the last year has pronounced that hypocrisy in a way that's basically obvious to everyone now.
Thank you, Assal. We'll end on one last question, the million-dollar question. What do you think will happen next?
As a historian, I try to avoid predictions. I like to look at the past more than the future because, we can look at the past to try and understand what are possibilities. But it's when you're dealing with volatile situations, when you're dealing with something that's this tense, when you're dealing with war and conflict, it's unpredictable by its nature, right? There's a lot of times that when you look at the history of things, what caused a huge war that lasted many years was not the intention at all. Or the intention was a war, but the belief was, mission accomplished. Infamously, George Bush, a month after the invasion of Iraq, with a big sign that said mission accomplished, right? So there's a lot of factors that can complicate what happens because these are just people that are making decisions. What should come next, I would say, is de-escalation. And I don't mean de-escalation through escalation, as was the most ridiculous thing that Israel tried to present as what they were doing in Lebanon. Of course, if Iran tried to use that line, so we're doing the same thing, right? Apparently this is a way that you de-escalate, is actually by escalating. So I think actual de-escalation should be the next thing that we do, because what is clear is that a war will not benefit anybody in the region. It's not going to benefit the Israeli people. It's not going to benefit Iranian people. It's not going to benefit Palestinians or Lebanese or anybody in the region, right? Ordinary people are the ones who will suffer the most, as we have very clearly seen, not only in this last year, but in every conflict before. And so I think that whether that's going to happen is really up to the US, as much as the Biden administration tries to deny this, right? And as much as the media will run stories. There was another one yesterday from Politico that said, Biden reaches the limits of his influence on Israel. An absurd statement. Biden has not tried to influence Israel in any way. The massive amounts of leverage that he has, he's used none of. So sort of starting by getting away from this delusion that there is nothing that the most powerful country on the planet can do, when it is that country that is providing the funds, the means, and the weapons to continue what is happening. I'm not even talking about punitive measures, which it has, right? I haven't even gotten to sanctions, right? The way that it uses sanctions on other states. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it became the most sanctioned country in the world overnight. So we're not even getting there. I'm talking about things like conditioning aid. I'm talking about things like stop sending weapons. Allow the ICJ and the ICC to act as international institutions of accountability rather than rejecting them and undermining them. Like the basic things that the US could do to actually create pressure, and that we have historical precedent that US presidents have been able to do, like the example of Ronald Reagan in 1982, calling up, one phone call and to Israel's prime minister at the time stops the bombing of Lebanon within 20 minutes. That's the power that the US has. That is the power that Joe Biden has, and he's refusing to use it. So what I hope we do is put enough pressure on our elected officials to actually use the leverage they have to stop this from escalating any further.
There's even more precedents. I think even George H.W. Bush did the same thing with Israel, conditioned weapons for them.
Oh, you could go back decades. You could look at the Suez Crisis and how the Eisenhower administration
Right.
handled it. I mean, the idea that this kind of language that Biden officials use of, well, Israel is a sovereign state, they can do whatever they want. That's not really how sovereignty works. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You can do what you want that doesn't violate other countries' sovereignty, right? That's not how you can think about that individually, right? When we say we're a free country, that doesn't mean I'm not free to murder someone.
Right.
This is like absurd to talk about it this way. They're not free to do whatever they want. Do they make their own decisions? Yes. But there are still, at least there should be, this idea that there are rules of war, that there are rules of engagement, that there is international law. And that is all anybody's expecting the U.S. to do. Essentially, what it boils down to is we're expecting the U.S. to do what they say.
Okay, I know I said that was my last question, but I have one more question. How do you see Iran's attack on Israel? Do you see it as a success, a show of force? Israel is claiming that it wasn't successful at all. They intercepted all the missiles. What's your take on that?
Well, the idea, let's talk less about my opinion and the way that these states talk about it themselves. The fact that Israel says it wasn't a success, this is part of the sort of like a psychology of adversarial relationships or warfare. Iran says the same thing. When Israel carried an attack out on Iran in retaliation for retaliation in April, Iran said the same thing. Every time something happens, they downplay it because in order to sort of save face, none of these states will say, yes, they hit us really bad. Like, that's just not the nature of politics within these states. So, do we know whether or not, how are we defining success? That in and of itself is an issue because, for one thing, the Iranian attacks obviously did not cause casualties in the way that we've seen Israeli attacks.
Right.
In terms of the public discourse, we've seen Israelis sort of mock and ridicule it and say that's the reason it wasn't successful, which seems odd. So then that means you're measuring success by killing people rather than targeting infrastructure. Was it a success if your measure of success is deterrence? We'll see what the response is from Israel. It's hard to say in that sense. I think the important thing to take from it is there has to be an off-ramp or conflict will just build on each other, right? Like it will, if no one tries to actually stop it, it'll just keep going. And the position that the US has taken, which is, well, Israel can just keep going and no one else will do anything or is allowed to do anything, is not a tenable position. That's not going to work because eventually, and I think that's what we learned from this kind of episode, eventually other states, other actors will respond. And that's just the case across the board. I mean, when it comes to even the occupation itself, Israel's occupation, that is now decades long, the idea that Palestinians are just supposed to surrender is not, I mean, you could take issue with it first morally. Why do Palestinians why shouldn't Palestinians have equal rights? So there's the moral issue with that. There's also the pragmatic one, which is no one would accept that fate. No one would just surrender into living basically an imprisoned life, to be occupied, to not have freedoms, because there's a power that lords over them. That's where resistance comes from, and it's where it's come from historically. So this idea that, the US and Israel can just maintain this edge forever is just not a viable way long term to deal with the very issues that are real. And so I think it requires us to go to the root causes. Like we are talking about the consequences. We're talking about the symptoms. We're not talking about the disease. We're not talking about the roots. And that's the most important thing to understand if you actually want to resolve anything.
Nicely put. Well, thank you, SL, for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. and hope to speak with you again soon.
I would be happy to. Thank you again for having me on.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a non-profit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.